It is likely that your company will need to file tax forms at the end of the year to show that you are in compliance with the Affordable Care Act. If your business is required to provide these forms, there are steps you can take now to update the information regarding the health care plans that you offer to your employees, which will ensure that you are ready to generate these forms when the time comes. Now that you have completed this lesson, you should be able to set your healthcare plan defaults in payroll settings, enter healthcare plan and dependent information if necessary for your employees, and use reports to help verify the accuracy of the tracked healthcare plan information. This chart provides, at a glance, the Affordable Care Act forms and information that must be provided to employees and the IRS at the end of the year. The number of full-time equivalent employees employed at your business and the type of health care plan you have offered to them will determine what forms you are required to submit and what information or sections you are required to complete on them. All of the forms listed above are available to be printed and/or e-filed in payroll under Tasks, Federal E-File and Reporting. Once you have determined which forms you are required to submit and the sections you are required to complete on those forms, you will want to make sure you are tracking the information necessary to complete them in your payroll software, which is our focus for the remainder of this lesson. You can pause this video using the buttons in the play bar below if you would like more time to examine this chart. Let's start by recording the default healthcare plan information for your company in payroll. Go to File, Company Settings, PR Settings, ACA Settings. This window is used to specify default settings for reporting healthcare coverage for the Affordable Care Act. For each employee, you can choose to use either the default values entered in each of the fields here, or you can select specific values for each individual. For the purposes of this demonstration, we will be completing all of the fields in this window. However, the information you will need to provide here depends on which forms you will be filing. If you have determined that you will be submitting the 1094 and 1095-C forms, you will need to select the default coverage code, safe harbor code, and enter the default plan share cost amount. The values you use here are used as defaults for each of your employees and are used to complete Part 2 of the 1095-C form. If applicable, in the default coverage code list, select the type of healthcare coverage your company usually offers full-time employees. For more information about the coverage codes, see the instructions for Forms 1094-C and 1095-C on the Internal Revenue Service website. If your company offered minimum essential healthcare coverage providing minimum value, type the monthly premium amount for self-coverage for the lowest cost monthly premium in the default plan share cost field. If your company qualifies for a safe harbor, select the applicable safe harbor code. Otherwise, select an option that reflects the usual employment status or enrollment status. And again, for more information regarding coverage codes, safe harbor codes, and other Affordable Care Act reporting requirements, see the instructions for Forms 1094-C and 1095-C on the Internal Revenue Service website. You may also want to contact your tax advisor for assistance with the Affordable Care Act requirements. If you have determined that you will be submitting the 1094 and 1095-B forms, the only field you will need to select here is the default origin of policy code. This value is reported on line 8 in Part 1 of the 1095-B forms. For more information about the origin of policy codes, see the instructions for Forms 1094-B and 1095-B on the Internal Revenue Service website. Like all other fields in this window, the value you select here will be used as the default origin of policy code for all employees, but you are able to override this information in the employee setup when it is appropriate. After you have selected the default settings that apply to your company, click OK to close the ACA settings window. and then click OK again to exit from the PR settings window. Now that you have entered the default values to use for Affordable Care Act reporting, the next step is to update the employee records. From the Setup menu, select Employees. And once you have an employee selected, go to the ACA Coverage tab. Use this tab of the Employee Setup window to record information about this employee's health care plan to use for reporting required by the Affordable Care Act. Start by selecting the ACA Exempt status, which determines if the employee should be included or excluded from Affordable Care Act reporting. If the employee is not exempt from Affordable Care Act reporting, select either full-time if the employee works full-time or not exempt if the employee works part-time. If the employee is exempt from Affordable Care Act reporting, select one of the exempt statuses in this list. Use Exempt Employer if the employee is also the employer or owner of the company. Use Exempt Relative if the employee is a relative of the employer or owner. Or use Exempt Seasonal if the employee is seasonal. We recommend you review the documentation for Affordable Care Act reporting on the IRS website to determine if an employee is seasonal or not. If this employee is not currently employed, use the status of not working, so they are excluded from Affordable Care Act reporting. Only the employees with an ACA exempt status of full-time or not exempt here on the ACA Coverage tab will be included on Affordable Care Act tax forms when you file them at the end of the year. If the health care plan information offered to this employee differs from the default values you specified for the coverage code, plan share amount, safe harbor code, and origin of policy code in payroll settings, change or enter the information as appropriate. Otherwise, you can leave the coverage code, safe harbor code, and origin of policy code set to default, and the plan share amount field blank, and it will use the default values you entered in payroll settings for this employee. After you have assigned the correct values to use for this employee, click the Save button, and then click the Employee Dependent Detail button, which will open the Affordable Care Act Compliance Details window. Use the upper portion of this window to record the details of the healthcare plan offered to this employee for each month in the current calendar year if they need to be customized. The values for ACA exemption status, offer of coverage, employee share of premium, and applicable safe harbor will pre-fill for each month in the year based on what was selected for this employee on the previous tab. But if the plan information for this employee changes during the year, you can click into the appropriate field and make changes. For example, if the exemption status for an employee needs to be changed midway through the year, select the field in the month the change needs to be reflected and choose a different status. Notice that the status change is automatically applied to the right, assigning the new value to the remaining months in the year. You can follow the same steps to make changes by month to the offer of coverage, employee share of premium, and applicable safe harbor fields as well, each of which will pre-fill the values for the remaining months in the year if changed. Remember, the values specified in the offer of coverage, employee share of premium, and applicable safe harbor fields will be used to complete Part 2 of the 1095-C form. So you only need to track this information for each employee if you need to submit this form. If your company offered a self-insured healthcare plan and this employee is enrolled, select this checkbox. And if anyone other than the employee themselves is covered by this plan, you will also need to enter their information in the lower portion of this window so that it is included in the appropriate section on your year-end forms. Please note that this information is only required for employees enrolled in an employer-sponsored self-insured healthcare plan. So if your company's plan is not self-insured, you do not need to enter this information. To enter the information for a covered individual under a self-insured healthcare plan, click here and you can enter their name here. It is important to enter the name using the correct format of last name, semicolon, first name, middle name, so that it is printed correctly on tax forms. Then enter the Social Security number, birth date, and select the months that this person was covered by the health insurance plan offered to the employee. If the person was covered for the entire year, select January, and all of the months to the right will be automatically selected as well. You can then make changes if necessary. After the information for this individual is entered, you can click here again to start a new line for another individual covered under this employee's healthcare plan. Changes you make here are not automatically saved to the database, so be sure to click the Save button before using the X in the upper right corner to close this window. This will bring you back to the ACA Coverage tab of the Employee Setup. Click Save again, and then you can move on to the next employee. Let's say you have an employee who was working full-time and then left the company midway through the year. Access their record in the Employee Setup window, and on the ACA Coverage tab, click the Employee Dependents Detail button. In the upper portion of the Affordable Care Act Compliance Details window, you can change the ACA exemption status to Not Working in the appropriate monthly column. And like other changes in this window, the Not Working status is then applied to the remaining months in the year automatically. Keep in mind that depending on your situation, it may also be appropriate for you to update the offer of coverage, employee share of premium, and safe harbor information for the remaining months in the year, depending on how the information must be reported on the 1095-C form. See the instructions for Forms 1094-C and 1095-C on the IRS website for details about how this information should be reported on these forms. Now click Save, and use the X in the top right corner to close this window. This status change is only used for Affordable Care Act reporting purposes, so it is still important to enter the termination date on the Miscellaneous Info tab for the employee as well. Now click Save, and you can continue on to the next employee, or if you are all done, click Close. There are two reports available that you can use to verify that the healthcare information entered for your employees and their covered individuals, if applicable, has been entered correctly. Go to Reports, ACA Reporting. Let's select the ACA Employee Coverage Report. This report will display the information entered in the upper portion of the Affordable Care Act compliance window for the year specified here. You can use the Ranges or Conditions buttons to limit which employees are displayed. Here you will see all of the details for the healthcare plan coverage by month that have been entered for each employee. Use this report to review the selections made on each employee to confirm that accurate healthcare plan information is being tracked in the system. The second report we will view is used to verify that the information has been entered correctly for the covered individuals of employees who are enrolled in a self-insured healthcare plan offered by the employer. Go to Reports, ACA Reporting, and select the ACA Dependent Coverage Report. This report will display the information for covered individuals under an employer self-insured healthcare plan entered in the lower portion of the Affordable Care Act Compliance Details window for each employee for the year specified here. For each employee, the covered individuals that were entered are listed with an X for each month during that year that they were covered under the self-insured healthcare plan. At the end of the year, when you need to prepare your ACA tax forms, you will use the information that you enter in the Affordable Care Act Compliance Details tab for each employee, which you can review periodically with the reports we just looked at. Now that you have completed this lesson, you should be able to set your healthcare plan defaults in payroll settings, enter healthcare plan and dependent information if necessary for your employees, and use reports to help verify the accuracy of the tracked healthcare plan information.